This is your 5.3 lesson in changes of supply. I'd like everyone to get their notes out, actually take notes this time because I've struck a deal with Plumber. Instead of taking a quiz, you guys are gonna write a essay or just a one-page paragraph about an industry, and you're gonna implement the points you learn here about changes of supply in that industry. And I also managed to ask for, if you do a full page, you get plus 10, so plus 10 bonus points. I'll explain more later. So our lesson is in changes apply. There's many things that, in this lesson we're going to go through all the points, at least in the section that can affect supply. And just like with demand, in Ceteris Paribus, not everything is fixed. Supply is always changing based on different factors. So first, any change in cost of production will cause your supply to change. If it takes more to buy plastic to produce tables, we're going to produce less tables. If it costs more to operate it, like it takes fuel to operate or more electricity to operate these machinery, we're still going to produce, because that's increasing our costs and it's not worth it after a while. So basically, if you write this down in your notes, increased cost, fall in supply, decreased cost, increase in supply. Another thing that will, these points adversely affect supply. Another point that will affect supply is technology. As we further in technology, our supply will actually increase because it makes our businesses more efficient. With our auto industry, Ford introduced the assembly line, and everyone had a task and they did it. Now we have robots who put together those robots, and that increases how much we can produce. So we produce more, and especially when we can keep the price around the same. Another good example in your book is email communication. When we can talk faster and change things faster, that also increases our supply. So technology definitely helps our supply. Example would be our computers. In like 1950s, computers took up rooms, but technology, we got our microchip, and we have become more efficient in making that, so we can produce more computers, and that increases our supply as technology increases. Also, our raw materials, machinery, and labor, this all costs less, right? Because more people are getting a job, so we have more supply of people that we can pick from and say, hey, I want you to design a computer, instead of we only had one person who's an expert, and we'd have to pay him a whole bunch to just come help us with the computer. And the materials definitely to build computers, they are not as expensive as they would be because you can mass produce them. Alright. Government influence. The other points that can affect our supply is the government. In general, you don't want the government to, but here are some ways that it can. First one is subsidies, which is basically giving money from the government to certain markets and industries that they think need it or that they want to give it to. There's a whole list in your book. I think each paragraph has a different example of how the government uses subsidies to affect different industries and their reasons for doing it. I thought of military. If we want a good military and the government wants a good military, they're going to invest in companies that are developing like radar. And so they're going to give this company a subsidy to continue their research, and that would help us, develop military products. I'll just go through each one of these because I think they're good and important to know. World War II, that just laid waste to all of Europe, and their farming is not good, and so they bought imports from us. Now, the U.S. can produce food very, very cheap, and we almost import to every continent for very cheap imports. So that gives us a lot of power as far as price and saying, if we wanted to say, hey, I don't I think we should jack up the price. You know, all these other countries are screwed, basically. So what some European countries do is they give farmers a subsidy and say, you know, even though it's not efficient for them to produce food, they get this money, and then that says, oh yes, we can produce goods cheaper, and so that's how subsidies, and they'll protect businesses just in case we decide to do something. People do it to protect growing businesses, so I don't know, you can bring tariffs into this. Trump is doing tariffs to protect our steel industry as far as importing steel, so you can also use subsidies in that way. Instead, Malaysia uses subsidies to protect a car just for pride. Domestic car, just to protect their pride of saying, we made this car in this country. You know, we have the made in the USA instead of made in China. It's like giving a subsidy to made in USA companies so that they can produce goods cheaper, and that increases supply, right? I have very controversial. The other controversial part of subsidies is in farms. Now, the last paragraph in your book, it states it very, it's just awful stating. It says, farm subsidies are particularly controversial, especially when farmers are paid to take land out of cultivation to keep prices high. So basically, we want our prices of crops to be high, so the government gives money to a farmer and says, hey, don't produce a whole bunch because, you know, with the increase in supply, the price is not going to be as high. It rhymes, sorry. Anyway, so they pay people, don't use this. And then what happens is this penalizes farmers that are more efficient, that could use all of their land and produce a ton of crops, right? It penalizes them. And then instead, to increase their product on that one part of the land, they use herbicides and pesticides, and so you can see where that becomes controversy as far as environmental protection and all that. So subsidies, they can affect supply in different ways. It just depends on how they're used, and you know, in some industries they're appropriate, some industries they're not. The other way that government can affect our supply is taxes. Excess taxes is in your book, and that would be, excess taxes are taxes on the production of a good. So I think they do this on cigarettes and alcohol and stuff. It's pretty obvious that these are not good for your health. So the government says, we'll tax your production of this, and that will decrease the supply. I mean, if enough people don't demand it after a while because the price is too high. But they tax this, and it is just factored into the price, so consumers don't notice it. I believe that's one of your questions for your book, if you want to write that down. Anyway, the taxes decreases supply because it's an extra cost, just like in your previous slide. Increased cost, fall in supply. So you got your taxes, increased cost, it's going to fall in your supply. You can do interest rates. As you can see in the current stock market, they increased interest rates, and so everyone is not investing in stuff, and that's a decrease in supply. You know, if it costs more to do something, it's going to decrease in supply. And then tariffs, I kind of factor them into subsidies. The other way that government can affect our supply or change supplies is with regulation. With our cars have to be more fuel efficient and less CO2 emissions and stuff. Well, that takes more technology to be put in the car to make it not emit so many CO2, particles, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, this costs more, so the supply will decrease for fuel efficient cars. But since the government, enforced, well, so the regulation with cars, I mentioned that it will make them more fuel efficient. So overall, before the government made this law, we're gonna have a ton of non-efficient cars, right? Fuel efficient cars, or dirty cars, I guess if you want to call them. we make this law, the supply of our fuel efficient cars will go up, but overall cars will go down because it costs more to make a car. You can also do this, apply regulation with medicine. I mean, basically any time you hear regulation, it's going to be on medicine and food and stuff. If it costs more to make it safe, preserve it and stuff for over a period of time, there's going to be less of it. There are, besides the government factors and the just raising cost factors, there's other factors that affect your supply. First one is foreign factors, which is basically all the components that it takes to build a car. Let's say you got your engine, you got the frame, and all this. If you go down the supply chain and you have to bring all these parts together to build it. If someone down in Mexico who's building the car, if they increase their wages and stuff, that costs more to increase that part, which then you bring over to that, which increases the cost of that part, which you're going to bring over to your car, which increases the cost of your car, so the supply is going to go down from that. So just, if you think of foreign, if it's, just go up the supply chain or down the supply chain and figure out how that affects your industry when you do that. Expectation of rising prices, just the idea of thinking a price is going to raise or a price is going to lower also affects our supply, because if you have a large supply of something, let's marketing books. If you have a large supply of marketing books and you realize, or you get a tip from someone that says in the next week the demand for marketing books is gonna rise exponentially, you're gonna hold on to those and then sell them then. So that affects the supply then and in the future, because right now they're not gonna have a whole bunch, but then later they're gonna have a ton. And it also works the other way. If you think prices are gonna drop soon, you're gonna put your products out there right now, which will increase the supply. Inflation of currency is also another good factor that will change supply, because a good doesn't really change its worth or value, while money changes all the time. I mean, I went to Latvia over the summer, and it was kind of surprising how often our currency changed. I mean, you don't realize it here now, but it does change a whole bunch. Anyway, if you think your money's gonna inflate pretty soon and lose its value, you don't want to sell your good and then have money that's gonna lose value. You want to hold on to your good until your money is gonna hold its value, right? So the example that they give in the book, which is very interesting, is during the Civil War, the South, they're coming up with their currency, and the inflation is really high. And so the storekeepers and the people in charge of storage places, they knew that the demand for food is going to rise, but they don't want to sell it, get some money that's going to inflate, and then that's going to be worthless, right? So they hold on to it and expect the prices to raise, until they can, it's worthwhile to sell it. Well, eventually, people got angry with them and just started breaking in and stealing it, so they lost there. Anyway, the other point is number of suppliers. If you have a business that is profitable, and then another person sees that, they're gonna join in, because right here, people will go where there's a profit to be made. So people will follow the money, basically. I mean, if people say there's a pizza industry, there's a pizza market, people will start joining it. Well, the increase in suppliers will also increase your supply, right? So that's another point you can add if you want to in your essay quiz. But the location also affects our amount of supply. Favorable conditions, this plays a big part in farming. You don't want to grow tomatoes in the mountains. Location, we want to supply of an object will be based on its location. So Well, if you understand, like gold is rare, so that's what, and it, so favorable conditions affect our supply. If this plays a big role in farms, people are gonna locate their farm where they can produce the most. So next to a river, there's gonna be a whole bunch of farms because there's fertile ground, there's water, right? So just favorable conditions, people are gonna locate their firms where they can supply the most and increase their profits. Another interesting point on location is if output is bulky or perishable, then the firms locate close to the customers instead of close to the production. An example in the book is soda. You know, they produce a high concentrated syrup and they bottle it at a local carbonated water place. Now, would it make more sense to bring all this carbonated water to the factory where the syrup is made, or take the concentrated syrup to the carbonated water? Well, we can fit more concentrated syrup on a truck, on a Coca-Cola truck, and bring it to the bottling place, which would be close to the consumer, and then distribute it because of weight, you know, than to bring the carbonated water to the syrup place and then give it to the consumer, if that makes sense. And then, so if you could incorporate that into your industry, that'd be very interesting. If input can't be moved easily, then firms locate close to the input. So this is basically the opposite. I was thinking distillation, you know, they can't move water very easily. Salt water, right? Distillation, they're making salt water into fresh water. They can't move salt water very easily inland. So the distillation you often see are just right next to the coast, where they can just pump salt water in and transport fresh water out. And then some other small points on location. Some more small points on as far as location and how that affects supply. Firms will locate to low-cost areas to run their business. That's why Cabela's is kind of a strange thing to have in Sydney, because you could move to a bigger city where it's costs less to run a business. I know there's difficulties as far as communication and all that, but people also would like to locate next to cities where they can have a surplus of workers that they can have next to their industries. And then answers for your 5.3 review, we can go through that right now if you like. First question: unable to control price, a profitable producer faced with rising labor or material costs will what? Now if we go back to the first paragraph, they can't control their price, they can't lower or rise their price. But they are faced with increasing costs. So according to our simple formula here, that means they will decrease their supply of production of goods. Second one, new technology affects supply by what? So with new technology, producing stuff is more efficient, and that lowers the cost. So new technology affects supply by lowering production costs. Third question, European governments often subsidize food producers because they blank. We talked about this here. I didn't talk about French farms, but in general, European countries want to protect their domestic farms from cheaper imports so that they have something to back up on. And then you can also put, if you like, France uses subsidies to protect their kind of lifestyle and kind of historical value of French farms. You know, pretty cool looking farmhouse there. So they use subsidies to also protect their countryside as far as France is concerned. But the main point you want to write down is protect domestic farms from cheaper goods. In the past, Western European governments subsidized banks and airlines by, I didn't talk about this, but it's in your book, covering their debts. So basically, these airline companies and banks could do whatever they like, and even in debt, the government would come in and pay for it. And so that's why subsidies, as far as that is, it's not appreciated, because it's kind of tipping the balance in favor of them instead of free market, where we want a fair competition between places. The United States, fifth question, the United States government subsidizes many industries, including, I put agriculture. I think that's our big one right now. We talked about the uncultivated land, in which they give money to farmers. Sixth question, an excess tax increases production costs by, it just adds extra cost for each unit sold. I think that's nothing much to go further in that. Consumers may be unaware of excess taxes because it's indirect and built into the product's prices. So basically what that means is they tax the producer, the production of it, and so the producer just fits that cost into their product. So the consumer doesn't really realize it. 8, government regulations often reduce supply because, well, it just costs more to produce something, so increased costs, fall in supply. During periods of inflation, suppliers may temporarily withhold goods that can be stored for long periods because goods hold their value, and if the person with the good decides to sell it, their money would just be inflated and lose value soon. So they hold on to it because goods hold their value. Question 10, government can increase supply by granting producers a subsidy, and then to reduce supply, a government might levy an excess tax. Your book questions for 5.3. The first one is, why does the supply curve shift? Just the supply curve shifts because of outside factors that increase and decrease supply. So all of these bullet points is a different factor that will affect supply. Question 2, give an example of how change in the number of suppliers has changed the supply of a good or service. You could just do pizza, you know. If we just had Pizza Hut, we'd have a limited supply of pizza, but now we have Sam & Louie's and Domino's and Blackjack's, and now all these people that are producing pizza, and so we have an increased supply. And I would not use that example, come up with your own. What is the subsidy? It's just government money given to a specific market or industry. And then how do they affect the supply curve? They can affect it in multiple ways. I mean, if you think about the American farms, they give us a subsidy not to produce, and so that would decrease supply. But if they give us a subsidy to increase production, it could shift the supply curve to the right? The excess tax, and what is an excess tax? That's just the tax on the production of a good. And how do excess taxes affect the supply curve? Well, since it's an increased cost, it will shift it to the left. The last question from your book question should be question number 5. It says, what effects do regulations have on the supply curve and why? It can affect it both ways, because if you think about it, if I put a regulation on cars, fuel efficient cars, you know, it's going to shift it to the left as far as all kinds of cars, but fuel efficient cars, they'll shift it to the right. So in general, it will shift to the left because it increases cost of production. However, some businesses can benefit from regulation, and that would shift their supply curve to the right. And that is your 5.3 section.